Welcome back to Rethinking Politics, episode 58. There is so much to talk about here. Brad's awkward comments early on in the episodes where he just interjects random things.
Saying hello is not random, Dan.
The way you said it made me think of Gus from Psych.
That's what I was.
Is that what you were channeling?
That's what I was going for.
You were channeling Gus. Hello. What does he call himself in that episode? I love that one where he's in the radio DJ.
A player named Gus.
A player named Gus.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. We have much different news than Psych, though we should just talk about Psych for an episode. That'd be way more fun.
Fantastic TV show.
It's beautiful. There are two big things in the news. The abortion law in Texas, which is people presented as a challenge to Roe v. Wade. They've said all kinds of things about it, most of which is BS. Let me put that a little more diplomatically. Most of which does not quite grasp what happened. Let's put it that way. And as usual, the first reaction is to make it sound much bigger, like a much bigger deal than it is. And the other thing that's happening, Afghanistan, it's the week of 9/11. We did an episode last week on foreign policy talking about that kind of sphere of things. And of course, the vaccine mandates, which have come out. We can only talk about one of these things. There's so much to talk about related to the vaccine mandates and the abortion law. Today, we're going to talk about the abortion law. Set aside the vaccine mandates for now. The abortion law is so strange, and there's so much related to this issue. As Brad and I were prepping for this has got to be the hardest prep in a long time. And perhaps the hardest one for me. The issues related to it are just... Some of it is very clear to me, and some of it is very unclear. I can draw some lines, and in other areas, I'm really not sure. And we're going to walk through that a little bit, and we're going to talk about the law itself. We're going to talk about Roe v. Wade. We're going to talk about the way that the debate is had between the parties and the way, the differences in stance. And then we're going to go into what exactly should be done about it. How do you address this issue? How do you talk about this issue? Mm-hmm. How do you, if it is what conservatives believe it is, how do you remedy it? Because the court is supposedly a conservative court pushing a conservative solution here in this example. That's up for debate, as you'll see as we get into the details. But certainly Roe v. Wade is a big issue that splits the parties in a very strong way.
Absolutely. One of the more partisan issues out there. And we've mentioned it in the past in discussing partisanship.
One thing we said about it before that I think still stands very, very well is that the solution to this, one way or another, is probably not going to be through law because of how big of an issue it is to the people involved and because of, just how firmly opposed the beliefs are. You can't get this isn't a situation where you can say, well, you do your thing and we'll do ours. The views are mutually incompatible. You can't, This isn't like, well, in your state, you deal with gun control your way and we'll deal with it in ours. This is something very, very different. And that makes it very hard to come to any solution. And it makes it very difficult for the legal system to impose a solution one way or another because of how strongly people feel about it.
But before we get to that, Dan, let's talk about the law itself, both the law in Texas and the Supreme Court's response to it. So first we've got the law in Texas, which is a novel approach to abortion. So of course, conservative governments have been basically continually applying different forms of abortion regulation and abortion restriction in their states ever since Roe v. Wade. Obviously before Roe v. Wade, but even after Roe v. Wade, some kind of abortion law is not unique. And in fact, since Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which was a clarification and a slight revision of Roe v. Wade. So in this case, it's actually more relevant. It's actually, Planned Parenthood versus Casey. But in either case, abortion even though it's protected under those Supreme Court rulings as a right, there are things that government can do in regards to abortion, and conservative governments are always trying to push that envelope. As Dan was saying, it is a very partisan issue, and so conservatives are unabashedly clear that they want to ban all abortion, or at least almost all abortion.
Right.
And this is an attempt to do that. I mean, this is, like I said, it's a novel case. It's definitely approached in a different way. First of all, the ban is extensive in that it starts at 6 weeks, which is very, very early on. Early on enough that by the time you find out you're pregnant, the ban is basically going to be in place.
6 weeks from your last period.
What's unique, though, about this legislation is how it's enforced. Instead of being enforced by the government, what they're doing and what critics are describing as vigilantism is they're allowing individual citizens to sue not the person getting the abortion, but any doctor or individual who helps them to get the abortion. They're allowed to sue them, and they're given standing by this law that any citizen of the state of Texas can sue someone for helping an abortion.
Yeah,
and that is something new.
It's a sort of common good argument that if for the good of Texas, everyone really is harmed by this, and thus everyone has standing.
Mm-hmm.
And it is new. And it's novel. There's a couple different ways that you can push cases. Like Brad was saying, you can push cases with the goal of creating a case that goes to the Supreme Court that you hope the court will rule favorably, or you can create something that you hope bypasses the precedents as they stand and lets you get around it. This is clearly aiming at getting around it.
Absolutely. This is not their desired goal when it comes to abortion. They would like to just ban it in the traditional sense, but by having it be something that's tried in civil courts where the government is not prosecuting these individuals, but rather individual citizens are simply suing them, they're hoping to get around the Supreme Court cases that have banned abortion laws.
Yeah.
Which is really weird. Which makes for really weird laws. And as you look at this Texas law, a lot of the provisions are questionable at best. And I would say that some of them are just straight up awful. One of the examples of that is that the defendant, so the doctor, I mean, most likely we're talking about a doctor here, or maybe an organization, maybe it's a clinic or something, but we're just going to say doctor from now on to make it easier. The defendant, can't recoup their costs or their attorney fees if they win. So you as an individual citizen hear about the $10,000 that you can win from one of these cases. You sue 300 doctors because why not? You're a abortion activist group. Like that's who's going to do this, right? You're an abortion activist group. So a pro-life group, and you sue a whole bunch of doctors, and those doctors, they hire lawyers. They spend time and money, a lot of time and money, defending themselves. Because if you're a doctor who does abortions on a regular basis, that's a lot of cases you're going to have to fight, and you win every single one. And you as a doctor win every single one. You're still going to have, at this point, you could potentially have hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. And the law is very clear that you cannot recoup those fees from the people who sued you, which means you have to pay every single dollar of that, which means even if you win, you still lose.
Yeah, it makes the accusation a penalty, right? It makes the accusation a punishment itself.
Which is a disturbing precedent.
Right. This has nothing to do with abortion, right? This is just a legal principle that generally, if someone falsely accuses you of something, or if the winner of the case, the other person often pays their legal fees. And it's
not always, but
not always,
very often.
Right. And the reason is because you don't want people suing someone. You get someone, for example, you get a big company like Walmart, and it sues a small competitor. It could sue them over and over and over again on false pretenses because and just watch why exactly to bankrupt them. Watch their money run out before Walmart's does. And then that company goes out of business. Now, there's ways that you can get around it, even if you do have to pay the legal fees. What you do is you draw it out so there's never a settlement in the hopes that they run out of money before you're forced to pay their legal fees. But in general, you don't want to open the door for people to sue in a circumstance where suing will accomplish their purpose whether they win or not, which is what this does. You could close an abortion clinic by suing them repeatedly, even if you don't win. And I say abortion clinic. You probably would win if it's an abortion clinic. You could sue anybody, right? And call it and say they're performing abortions and cause them to lose large amounts of money. Mm-hmm. And that's just not a good legal principle there. It's just not a good way to design the law.
Yeah, and there are more aspects of this law. For example, you as an individual in one county in Texas could sue a clinic or a doctor across the state, and that lawsuit would have to be settled that you initiated in your county. And that means that doctor or that clinic would have to travel in order to deal with to deal with your lawsuit. But they could be sued by 7 different other activist groups or individuals in 7 other counties and have cases across the entire state that they have to answer to and deal with. And that's clearly, as Dan was saying, a penalty or a punishment before any guilt has been established. Right. And because this is a civil suit, not a criminal conviction, the burden of proof is different. You don't need to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Beyond a reasonable doubt. Mm-hmm.
Or a reasonable doubt, thank you. That
shadow of a doubt's cooler.
It's way cooler. I'm going with shadow of a doubt. I'm going to propose we change it. But you don't need that burden of proof. You need a much lower burden of proof, and there are more provisions in this law limiting how the defense can defend themselves in order to further increase the likelihood that you will win and they will have to pay. In other words, this law is simply trying to ban abortions through another means. In other words, they're trying to make it so prohibitively expensive to perform an abortion that, 99% of the clinics out there, 99% of the doctors out there who perform abortions will have to stop. That is how the law is designed.
Yeah, it's just not going to be lucrative. You'd end up going bankrupt. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting approach. Obviously, the novelty of the main mechanism aside, setting aside the vigilante, as they've described it, and I actually like that word in this case, but that may be because I don't have the negative connotation associated with it that some people do. I'm all about vigilantes. I don't think the police have any authority beyond what's already in individual's authority. So in my mind, there is no distinction between an individual doing it and another person. Mm-hmm. But that's and a police officer. But that aside, the legal things in the law I don't like.
It's a bad law.
It's a bad
law. It
law.
really is.
I don't like the legal precedents.
Conservatives should not be in favor of. Regardless of how you feel about abortion, getting what you want, getting your political agenda accomplished through a law like this is, I think, a really bad idea. Because even if you win, even if this law is actually, especially if you win, if this law stands, we're all going to suffer because it's such a terrible precedent for legislation in general. For having a system that works this way is just a bad idea. Right,
and there might be a version of this law that keeps the primary mechanism that I would be more comfortable with. But as it is, I don't like this law much. I think it's very novel, and I think it's really interesting. So what happened with the Supreme Court is the Supreme Court was deciding whether or not to put a stay on this law. This often happens when there's a law that's come into place, and it's going to conflict with some legal precedent. It's going to raise questions. They often put a stay on the law until the courts work it out, right? Until there's no reason to put a questionable law into place until things are worked out. In order to do this, you have to have a case It takes a case to determine whether to stay a law. It takes a case for everything in the courts. The basic function of the court is to decide a case and controversy. Without a case, without a controversy, there can be no decision. They can't just make rules. And that's one thing that has never changed and I hope never does. So there has to be a case. So what is the case? Well, a group sued a judge based on the fact that he would be enforcing this unconstitutional law. And this is often how this happens. You pick, there's a law that's going to come into place in a state, and it's going to be against the Constitution, or so the argument goes. And so you pick a state actor, a state official, a judge, the attorney general, somebody. It doesn't really matter who. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's someone who's enforcing the law.
Someone who's enforcing
in that
the law.
Enforcement group.
Right. And the poor guy has his name on the case, even though he's not personally involved in any way. It's funny that way. You're like, why did they sue the Secretary of State? Like, I don't get what.
Who is this guy? And what did he do? Nothing. It doesn't really matter.
It doesn't matter. He's a representative of the state as the institution that's enforcing the law. And they bring this before the Supreme Court and they say, we need a stay. This is going to be happening. Here's our case. Here's how it works. And the liberal justices and Roberts, who is, his political beliefs are, who knows what. They are consistent in some ways, but it's not with a ordinary political thinking and ideology. He's odd. And then there's the 5 other conservative justices, and they decide not to put a stay on the law, not to stop it, so it's going to go into effect. The liberal justices rightfully say, this law is going to have to be decided by us, and it's awful. That's true. I agree with that assessment, even though I disagree with them on a lot of the principles around it that we're going to get into later regarding abortion. And the conservatives go, yes, but look at this. They've brought this judge before us who literally has nothing to do with the law. Normally the state is vaguely related. He's an enforcer. Mm-hmm. He represents the state. But in this case, the state isn't enforcing it. It's civil action. It will be private citizens enforcing this law. Which is to say that even more so than usual, this judge has nothing to do with it. And the Supreme Court's like, you can't bring this guy, the 5 conservatives, you can't bring this guy and say this is the case in controversy. It's not. This guy will literally never have anything to do with this and never could. He's on the side, just like anybody, just like mostly everyone else. Which is to say, you need a real case in controversy to come in here and have us even decide whether to really formally put a stay on it. And I agree with them too. I agree with both the liberals and the conservatives on the weirdness of this.
You know, it's funny because everything makes sense when you think about it. You know, Texas created this very funky law in order to avoid having the Supreme Court strike the law down, which obviously immediately worked in the sense that they didn't immediately place a stay on it, which they could have. And then, of course, the Supreme Court is accused of partisanship and of party politics and of legislating from the bench and all the things they're accused of when they do something you don't like, for actually not doing those things. Because in the sense of the Supreme Court, if the Supreme Court had placed a stay on the law, it would have been not because that was their job, but because they disliked the law so much, which would be partisan, which would be political. Instead, I mean, and I think, and you could argue that the conservative justices did the legally right thing for political reasons, and that's fine. You can always argue that for any Supreme Court decision, but it doesn't change the fact that when it comes to what the Supreme Court should do, they were following that more closely than the liberal justices who dissented, or Roberts who dissented.
Right.
Any of those 4.
Which brings us to a strange place, because I would guess what happens next is that they get the right case. They get somebody who actually sues an organization or a doctor. And they bring them in and they say, will you please put a stay on this and we'll work this out in the courts? And I bet the Supreme Court will say, yeah.
And it may not even be the Supreme Court. It might
it'll be an appeals
court,
court,
or a state court.
Right. And which is to say that what happened here is nothing.
No, and the Supreme Court in their unsigned, I wouldn't even call it a ruling. I'm not sure what you'd call it.
I don't know what you call it either.
In their unsigned statement, they are very clear that they are not closing the door to any of those avenues. That this can be stayed by someone else, and very likely will be. They're more than happy to acknowledge that they're not trying, as some have argued, to overturn Roe v. Wade by not saying this law. That's not what's going on here.
They're not even trying to support the law. They're not even trying to support the law. At least, like you said, maybe that is their goal in taking this action. But they're taking the right legal action in terms of the way that cases and controversies work before the court. They've made what I think is objectively the right call, which is to say, you need to bring us an actual case that shows this.
Because the Supreme Court's job is not to block any law that they disagree with politically. That's not their job. Their job is only to block a law if certain criteria are met in a very specific way, and then go and try that case. There's a process here that the Supreme Court is supposed to follow. But it turns out that people only want the Supreme Court to follow that process when it benefits them.
Yes, and it's in the Supreme Court the Supreme Court is the old organization, right? Everybody in it is relatively very old. The average age is very old.
They're also just old. They're not relatively old.
Who's
true. The youngest Supreme Court justice?
I don't know at this point. Nobody young. Nobody we would rightfully say is young. The point is, but you're absolutely right that they, and that makes them much more likely to follow the procedural things than any other group. The way it's structured, the way they're in there for life, all of it will make the Supreme Court the last group in any political group anywhere in the world to abandon procedure. And frankly, it's too boring for the political news media. Right? It really is too boring for them to be like, guys, this looks like something happened, but nothing happened. They're like, no, something happened. We're going to capitalize on it. They're threatening Roe v. Wade.
And we've already learned, especially in this age of extremes and of internet memes, that, and this is of course something people are talking about very often with COVID, is that the facts don't super matter, Dan. The fact that the Supreme Court just made a technical decision, they didn't actually rule on this law, let alone on Roe v. Wade, doesn't slow anyone down in terms of media coverage. No one's freaking out and saying, well, all these news media agencies are wrong. Well, of course, conservative news agencies are, but in general, they're not losing any viewership for misreporting the facts. No one's getting hurt by this politically. They're aware of what they're doing because what they're doing is working. And that's part of why things keep becoming so partisan, because no one's willing to stop and say, hey, I agree with your goal, but not the way you're executing it. Just like with the Texas lawmakers, conservatives are pro-life. And so it doesn't matter how messed up the law is, as long as it's pro-life, they'll back their Texas conservative representatives. And that's a real problem. Just like the liberals are, the liberal news medias. Also, you've got, liberal congressmen and congresswomen who are talking about how awful the Supreme Court is, and they're not being called out for it. And that's a real problem. On both sides, it's a real problem that we can't see even a single shade of nuance.
Yeah, it's the wartime mentality. They're on the same side. We're going to support them. They're on the nuance is dangerous to winning the battle. And so you avoid it. It's silly. So that's where the abortion law in Texas is. I predict it will get a stay in the near future. And then it will be decided in the courts. And maybe they'll decide it based on the precedents of Roe v. Wade. Maybe it'll get struck down for some of the other things that we mentioned. That it's clearly targeting certain things, and that that it is deliberately not neutral on areas where the law normally tries to be neutral. Yeah. In the procedural things. It might run into problems there that are such that it never ends up being a Supreme Court case about abortion at all.
Which would be interesting.
Which wouldn't stop the news media from making it about the Supreme Court upholding Roe. It wouldn't stop the machine. But that brings us to Roe v. Wade in general, in the legal precedents of abortion. You mentioned Planned Parenthood versus Casey. We've talked about legal precedents since the Supreme Court before a little bit. The Supreme Court and what they did with Roe v. Wade is, the details are probably not even worth rehashing at this point. You should know that the Supreme Court at this point, in a lot of its decisions, is simply a political body. It's not a judge. It's not doing something extraordinary. They're making partisan decisions based on their politics. And Roe v. Wade was an example.
Which is why we were so willing to acknowledge that the conservative justices may be choosing the correct action, but for the wrong reasons, for the political reasons.
Right. They might, because that's normal at this point in so many cases. And Roe v. Wade is absolutely that. Roe v. Wade claims there's a right to abortion within a certain time frame. You know, the trimester thing comes from Roe v. Wade, which is a completely anti-science view of pregnancy,
which is why that part gets changed.
That part gets changed later, right? Right. It's discarded because it's arbitrary, and you get this principle of viability, and you get this idea that abortions are protected up to viability. All of that, if you give a cursory glance to the Constitution and the amendments to the Constitution, you will not find the slightest hint of anything vaguely related to abortion. Mm-hmm. Nothing even vaguely related. To get to the point where you see in the Constitution a constitutional right to that is not a misreading of the Constitution. It's an anti-reading. You've decided not to read it, and you've decided to put things in it, right?
Yeah, and so when experts and pundits are talking about how what's going on here is flagrantly unconstitutional, that's obviously an overstatement of the most extreme degree, because there is no clause in the Constitution about protecting the right of abortion. And that's what Dan's talking about with the Supreme Court, is that the Supreme Court is built on precedent, and the precedent is simply previous rulings, which means you can deviate just ever so slightly from the constitutional text in a Supreme Court ruling, and it'll stand. And then you deviate from that deviation just a little bit. Mm-hmm. And over 200 years, you can find yourself in a situation where, based off of, pregnant pauses in the text of the Constitution, you can have an entire legal system that is considered part of the Constitution. I mean, you can look at the Interstate Commerce Clause, and you have the exact same thing, where the Supreme Court has blown that out of proportion, where now almost any act that any person commits in any state doing anything can be construed by the Supreme Court to either be unconstitutional or constitutionally protected, depending on how they're feeling. And that's what Dan's talking about here, is that it's not just about abortion, it's not just about Roe v. Wade, it's simply about the makeup and the way the Supreme Court rules. It is a legislative body, and we need to embrace that when the Supreme Court decided not to block this law summarily, it was a political action. Even though it might be technically correct, it is a political action.
Yeah, that's the way people
think
of it.
Because if the Supreme Court had more liberal justices, they probably would have dismissed it summarily.
Yeah, there'd have been
and
an
they would have given whatever reasons, and it wouldn't be technically correct. But the fact that it was technically correct was simply because more of the Supreme Court justices were leaning a certain way politically.
Yeah, and supposedly the conservative justices are picked specifically because of their loyalty to the original text. And
that's only partially
true. That's partially true. Right. We'll grant that that's partially true. And that a few of them over the years, I think, have that kind of commitment. But in general, I think to think of the Supreme Court as a political body is the right way to think of it, as Brad was saying. Sometimes, like, I've spent my whole life, if you had to say what has been my life in terms of education and practice, it has been to get to the point where I can read something and I can understand it. And reading the opinions on Roe v. Wade are some of the funniest reading I've ever done in my life. I've laughed myself to tears on more than one occasion because they're clearly making stuff up and they know it.
You quoted a little bit of it, right? In the pregnant pauses of the Constitution is something a Supreme Court justice actually
talks about in the penumbras of the words, the shadow that they cast. It is still funny to me. It'd probably be more funny, or maybe be less funny if it weren't about something so serious. Whatever the case, it's tragic.
It'd be less funny.
It'd be less funny, but it's also tragic.
The fact that it's so significant and it's so garbage is part of what makes it so funny.
Right.
I think so.
That's true. That's true.
If it weren't happening at the highest levels of legal interpretation of words, it would be less funny.
But before you get lost in the penumbra, Dan, I want to clarify why we're even talking about Roe v. Wade. We're talking about it because what we're saying is that when it comes down to it, first of all, abortion is really not a constitutional issue.
No.
It's not a constitutional issue. It is a political issue. But the thing is the Constitution can be amended. The Constitution can be changed. If we decide as a nation that we want to protect the right of abortion or ban abortions, either way, either way the nation goes, that can be done.
Yes, legally.
Even without the Supreme Court, even without the political machinations of the Supreme Court, it could be not easily done, but relatively easily done, especially if people agreed. The reason that hasn't happened is because people don't agree. It's because we keep getting Supreme Court justices who feel very strongly politically one way or the other. It keeps it messy. And so...
Right, which is to say there's no clear answer there waiting for people to pick up and be like, oh, I just need to defend the Constitution, and that means...
Exactly. Your answer to abortion really should not be about the Constitution, because it's just not
It's not addressed.
And there is no constitutional protection either way.
Right.
And so that means we need to deal with it differently. And so what we want to talk about, and forgive me, Dan, if I'm jumping the gun here, is what we want to talk about is all that nuance that people refuse to talk about. We want to talk about it in a kind of a different way than everyone does. We're not going to talk about the constitutionality. We're not going to talk about Roe v. Wade and what that proves one way or another. We're going to talk about it like two individuals discussing what is right and what is wrong, and what should be legally enforced and what shouldn't be at the basic level, right?
Can I add? I want another disclaimer, because that was a great disclaimer. I am ridiculously uncomfortable with this in a way that I haven't been in literally any other podcast. And I am going to put my foot in my mouth probably several times in the next hour or so, however long it takes us to discuss this. It's undoubtable, judging from our conversations about this before this episode. We're going to, no doubt, make some people very upset and sound very stupid. Because but if there's any...
Which won't be the first time for either of those.
Or the last.
Either of those.
But,
so bear with me a little bit on that, because it's...
And wait till we navigate all the pieces, because there are a lot more pieces than I expected here. There's a lot here. And with that, go for it, Brad.
So the first thing I want to say, and of the many things that will be said, is conservatives describe abortion as a very one-dimensional issue, that abortion is murder. And that's really all there is to it, that that conservatives, I mean, obviously you can break that down further, that conservatives believe that human life begins at conception. And that, therefore, when you knowingly kill an innocent life, even before it's born, an innocent human life, obviously you got to factor that in as well. I should have been more clear when I was speaking. But if you knowingly kill an innocent human life, it's an act of murder. And therefore, abortion, assuming that it's knowledgeable, assuming that they know what they're doing, is an act of murder, and therefore it should be stopped and punished just like murder. There are a number of problems,
or at least implied that it should be stopped like murder, right?
That's obviously the implication.
That's the implication.
If they believe that it's murder.
Yeah, functionally they often propose very different things. But carry on.
And that's the first problem, is that functionally conservatives approach it very much like it's not murder. And the reason is because even though they say it's murder, they understand that is a problem. Because I laugh, but this is not nearly so simple on any level. And to describe it that way is incredibly reductionist. And of course, I can't speak to this personally because I've never carried a child. I've never been pregnant. I've never been through any of that. I know people who have. Obviously, I've got, a 2-year-old son, and so I went through as much as I could as my wife went through her pregnancy and the childbirth. But there's so much that happens there that is personal to the woman who goes through that needs to be looked at. That needs to be taken into consideration. And that's often what conservatives do. And they look at it and they take a look at it and they say, this shouldn't be treated like murder. And I think the fact that conservatives realize it shouldn't be treated like murder might be evidence of the fact that maybe it's not murder. Because if it really is murder, then shouldn't it be prosecuted like murder? Shouldn't the woman who aborts her child spend the rest of her life in jail like you would want any other murderer to?
Right.
And yet, obviously, they don't want that because they realize that that's wrong, that there's something wrong, that there's a disconnect.
Yeah, in the way you're talking about it from a conservative perspective, right? We're assuming in this language the perspective of a conservative, many of which we actually share, that this is a human life. But is it murder? What is the crime being committed here? What actually is the crime? And if it's murder, we have a very clear precedent for how people should be treated. And maybe that precedent isn't always right, but certainly whatever the most extreme things you have to do with someone, it's murderers who you have to do it with. Whatever the limits of, maybe that's execution for some people. That's life in prison for others. That's depending on whether it's first degree, second degree, or third degree murder, right? It's going to vary a little bit. But we're talking, you can imagine this. Imagine that you accept the pro-life argument about it being a baby. It's actually a human life. It deserves to be protected. Do you throw the woman who induces an abortion in herself in jail for life? Obviously,
or at least
not.
For a very long time.
Or for a very long time.
If you match that up with other murder laws.
Which penalty that you give to murderers are you comfortable with attaching to that woman? And
because last time I checked, conservatives weren't on board with almost any kind of amnesty for murders or any other serious crime.
Right. And if you wouldn't waive it for them, why would you waive it here? The crime.
What's the difference?
Yes. If there is a crime, there clearly seems to be something different. And it's different in the way, as you said, the evidence is in the way that we would not treat them the same way. We would not treat them the same way. You would not treat someone who had an abortion like you'd treat a first-degree murder, which is to say you would get them under control and isolate them from society as fast as possible in the fear that they might, it's so different. It's so different. Mm-hmm. And to describe it as murder, it might be partially a tactical decision, right? Conservatives might say we should use the word murder because it gets the proper reaction for the seriousness of it. I don't think that's accurate. I think it's actually done a serious disservice.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that the evidence, as you were saying, that they don't actually believe that it's murder, and that you can see that in the way that they would treat people who participate in it, whether it be the doctor or the person seeking.
Of course, that's the funny thing here is that the problem is once you start using the rhetoric, you're naturally going to believe the rhetoric. And so I believe that what happens here is that, you follow that rhetoric. And so now a large number of people really do believe unilaterally that it is murder. And you may even have, maybe some people listening here who would agree and say, yes, it should be prosecuted
as murder,
just as murder. That it should be on that level, and in which case, our whole argument here is a wash, because they would say, yes, life begins at conception, it's an innocent life, it is murder, and let's prosecute it accordingly. And what's the answer to that, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, that's 25% of the population. First off, I'll make the functional argument, because that's easy. The functional argument is you can't do that. You really can't do that functionally in the United States. 25% of the women. That's it. It's not even close to the realm of possibility of enforcement. It's not even close.
It'd be like the war on drugs times 10.
Yes. You can't. There's a certain frequency of crime in which it just is not just impossible, but what it would take to enforce it would be so much worse than the crime itself. You would have to. There would be a war, and there would be all kinds of things, and It's one of the reasons why when we talked about abortion before, when we talked about it was in the context of partisanship, we mentioned that really a practical solution is going to take a great deal of persuasion, more than it will take a law, because there's no other way with how passionate the divide is and how close the divide is. But that's the easy way out, right? The argument that it is murder. First off, there's a problem of knowledge. If I act in a way that kills someone, my culpability is going to vary quite a bit. Mm-hmm. And if it's entirely
and we have manslaughter already as a common practice to factor that in.
Yeah, we used an example of driving a car. If I'm driving a car and I deliberately run someone over and they die, I've murdered them, or I've at least assaulted them, right? If I run somebody over accidentally and I'm negligent, it's manslaughter. And there's negligence.
And if you run someone over and there was nothing you could have done because they jumped in front of your car, now it's not even a crime.
It's not even a crime.
Which is super weird.
Right.
But it's true. You can kill someone without actually being charged with anything.
Yes.
Which is, of course, which is what self-defense is, and that's more common than running someone over and it not being your fault.
Yes, and we looked at spreading a virus through these three categories, right? Abortion is different than all of them in some ways.
It doesn't fit into those categories neatly. And part of the problem, Dan, is because in all these scenarios we're talking about, it involves so much more action. I mean, and so much in order to, if you murder someone, it's very easy to not murder someone. Let me put it this way. It's very easy to not run over someone with your car. If I choose not to run over someone with my car, it doesn't really make my day worse. It doesn't require a lot from me. If you're pregnant, and whether and we can get into whether or not you tried to get pregnant or whether or not you could have avoided it. There are factors like rape and other things there that do play an important role in this discussion,
right?
And part of why it's so nuanced. But the fact remains that holding all that aside for a second, if you are pregnant, choosing not to do anything has a very real cost for you in many different ways that choosing not to run someone over with your car does not have. You know what I mean? That every day that you carry that pregnancy is a real cost to you, and in many different physical and emotional ways. I mean, you can talk to anyone who's been pregnant and talk about how much work it is to carry that pregnancy. But on top of that, when you choose to carry through a pregnancy, you're choosing to bring a human being into this world. And at that point, you are responsible for what happens to that human being. And that's a very real obligation that you are then stuck with, regardless of what you choose to do after the pregnancy. I mean, it's not something that happens super common, but anyone who's known someone on either side of the adoption situation, whether they gave someone up for adoption or adopted someone or attempted to, you'll understand how incredibly painful the adoption process is for the mother. It's a very real cost and a very real harm that is done to the mother by carrying a baby to term and then giving that baby up.
Right. And it's the kind of, and we're not just talking procedural, right? The laws are a nightmare on adoption. But even if they were ideal, that's not going to prevent the emotional struggle that is giving up a child that is yours.
Yeah, and there's so much that goes on biologically that factors into that.
Uh-huh.
You know, there's because the conservatives argue that why abort your child when you can just carry that child to term and give it up? Let one of the many people who want to have a child and can't adopt that baby. And of course, they argue at the same time we should streamline the adoption process. Mm-hmm. You know, they acknowledge that there are flaws in the adoption system. Mm-hmm. So as Dan's saying, if we streamline that process, even still, often it doesn't work that way. Often by the time you carry that baby to term, you can't give it up for adoption for a number of reasons, a number of very strong
personal
biological factors. I mean, just the biological bond that's formed is so incredibly strong and has nothing to do with your political or personal beliefs. That just naturally happens and causes women to choose not to give up their child, even if that was their original plan, and even if they know that that is the best course of action for that child. You know, you can have a woman in who is not in a position to raise a child, understands that, and chooses to give up that baby for adoption, and then after giving birth to that child and those biological bonds are formed, is unable to do that. And that's a very real situation.
I don't know the percentage,
and that needs to be
it's
considered.
Common. That's common. I don't know how common, but it happens quite a bit.
Yeah, to reduce this is simply ignoring too many realities that are realities. And the reality of that is because of the combination of the difficulty of adoption on a political level, you know, through paperwork, the difficulty of the adoption on an emotional level, and the difficulty of the adoption on a biological level. The end result is that by choosing not to have an abortion, not only are you harming the mother, but you're actually going to harm the child. And that's a real argument that's made, right? that a child who's born in very terrible circumstances, you know, they could be abused physically, emotionally. They could, you know, not get the physical shelter and food and things that they require, and they could have stunted growth. So many different things. They could potentially die in childhood because of the fact that they were born, and that needs to be considered. And that's not something that needs to be considered when you're discussing murder. You know what I mean? This is totally different.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. So we've got a couple ideas, a couple threads spinning right now, and I want to talk about both of them still. One of them was the problem of knowledge I mentioned earlier, which is which doesn't quite map onto other crimes. Then there's this one that you've introduced, which is the fact that the act that ends a life here is not at all like when you're driving a car and you know it puts people at risk and you know you're responsible for the way it works, let alone if you're actually shooting at someone with a gun or something like that, right? These are very different. The crime that is a nurse forgetting to put the right medication in that then leads to complications that kills somebody is very different than driving a car or shooting a gun, right? There's you can look at things that where the circumstances are different enough that the principles have to be adapted to them, like we were talking about with the virus. And that's odd, because the action here that's taken and how the person understands that action are very different. And that is how you would judge the culpability. That's how you would say, if someone's done something wrong, how would you judge how culpable they are and what is necessary to solve the problem? Mm-hmm. Which is part 2 that we'll get into in a second, how to solve it. But the knowledge that a person has who goes in and has an abortion, when they honestly don't believe that they're ending a human life, is a serious consideration in terms of criminal culpability. Mm-hmm. That's not a mere, you can't just wave that away, right? You can't just say you're guilty of murder. That's not how that works. That's not how, and if you did, right, you'd end up treating them in a way that doesn't make any sense because you've assumed, because the intentionality is missing and you've just ignored that. The intentionality of ending a human life is missing. What that is present in a murder. In most cases, I guess not third degree technically, but anyway.
Yeah, and it's more than just knowledge. I mean, I had a conversation with my wife about this just yesterday after you and I were talking, Dan, and hopefully she'll forgive me for sharing this, and if not, I'll cut it out. But but she talked about how, well, I mean, she started by saying that first of all, I don't understand what it's like to be pregnant. She talked about the fact that you know, when she got pregnant, we decided to have a child. This was our plan. You know, we tried to get pregnant, and then she got pregnant. And she talked about how even after all of that, you know, all this work towards this, she talked about how she still had this fear and this little bit of trepidation, not even a little bit, but this trepidation at the fact that not only is she suffering now, but at the end of it comes a lot of pain and physical distress, and then on top of that, the responsibility for another human life, this huge obligation, and all of that places a lot of fear. That placed a lot of fear on her, and that made her at times afraid of the pregnancy and unhappy with the pregnancy, and something that she had to deal with. And that's in a situation where she's in a relatively stable relationship. You know, we've got, you know, I'm working, you know, we're in a stable situation financially. And she chose it. You know what I mean? This is what she wanted. All of those factors are some of, you know, the best factors you can have in terms of going into a pregnancy. And even with all of those factors, there was this very real fear that was associated with the pregnancy. Yeah. So imagine taking out all of those factors, taking out all of that knowledge that things are going to work out. And in terms of culpability, you know, it's almost like, you know, you talk about with murder, one of the biggest things with self-defense is that if you're afraid for your life, if you're afraid of what's going to happen, that excuses a decent amount of the choices that you make. You know, you can take reasonable actions to protect yourself.
If your fear is reasonable, yes.
If your fear is reasonable. And with abortion, there's a real argument to be made about reasonable fear, because you have a long history of children, of not just fear for yourself, but fear for your child. I know there are people who abort their baby, who abort their child, and I know I'm not using politically correct terminology here.
Well, no, this conversation is too real to worry about.
It's too real to so there's going to have to, I apologize for the offense, but I'm just trying to be genuine here. But that they are actually aborting their child in order to help protect their child. And that is their knowledge, even when they believe that child is alive. And that knowledge plays a very real effect on not just the legal way of viewing what they're doing, but also the moral way of viewing what they're doing. And I'm not saying what they're doing is good. I'm not trying to defend them as this is clearly the right action.
Right.
I'm saying this is a very real gray area. Yeah. In terms of moral reasoning and in terms of legal reasoning.
Yeah, there is a massive difference between, and I hear people make these arguments. They go, look, the child ultimately, if you do not let this woman abort the baby, she's going to carry the child to term. She's going to keep the child. The child is not going to have a good life. Right? The child, for the reasons you indicated, maybe they're poor, maybe the father's not in the picture. There's little chance of her finishing her school and different things. And this child's going to grow up in poverty and is much more likely to commit crimes, much more likely to get involved in other things that are going to have a negative impact on their life. And I've heard people say, so the child shouldn't have the chance to even try. Right? There's no reason to even let it try. And I think that conclusion is wrong. If you start from the assumption that it's murder, nothing else weighs up against it in a way that matters. And I agree with that. But this isn't murder. I start from the assumption that this is the loss of a human life. I accept that. I accept the traditional conservative position for a variety of reasons, most of which are I think the scientific case is there to say this is a human life and it should be protected. I think at conception is the only logical choice at which to draw the line and say this is a human life and it ought to be protected. That's usually where the conversation ends about abortion, right? It either is or it isn't, and from there everything else follows. But everything else doesn't follow. It doesn't. So much doesn't follow necessarily from that point. We started there, both of us agreeing on that point.
Yeah, we both agree on that point. Absolutely.
And look at this and go, man, where on earth do you go from there? Because in order to understand what the law should be, you need to understand what the crime and culpability are. And on that point, it's extremely difficult to draw any lines. I can say that in 99.9% of cases, it's clearly not murder.
And I want to add something here because we've spent a lot of time talking about how the conservative argument that it's murder is clearly reductionist and that it's more complicated than that. But on the flip side, the argument that's made by liberals that I'm not even sure if I can put this clearly enough, because I don't. Honestly, I'm exposed to more of the conservative argument than the liberal argument,
right?
So I
it's
don't
hard,
have as clear an understanding.
Represent it well,
but it is fundamentally based on the idea that having an abortion is not the taking of a life in the normal sense, because if it is, then at that point they're opening the door to having a discussion of what role the government should have, of any kind of discussion. And the liberals have been very clear that there is no discussion that abortion is an unassailable human right.
Yes.
Which means that it's unassailably not bad. And if it's human life in that process, if it's at conception human life, then you have to agree to have the discussion. And they claim that there is no discussion, which means that they take the opposite stance of the murder. That the conservatives say this is murder, and the liberals say this is not a human life.
Yeah.
And we firmly believe that both of those sides are wrong. As Dan's saying, if you look up the biological check marks that are accomplished during this process, that there is no clear line beyond conception where you can say it wasn't alive before and it is alive now. That viability is not about whether or not it's alive, it's about whether or not it could possibly survive outside of the womb. And that's simply not a good check mark for life, because you can have someone theoretically, you could have someone who's so severely handicapped that they can't survive even for 2 seconds. Maybe they're on an incubator or something for years. Does that mean they're no longer alive? You know what I mean? You can argue consciousness, you can argue brain function, all of these things. There are cases in the real world where we have fully established that they are still a human life.
Yeah, you can't draw a line in those areas without authorizing the deaths of people who are not in the womb. There's no principle you could draw that would be consistent with other people, with people that aren't babies.
Which is why you need to acknowledge that. Really, just from a practical standpoint, there's no line you can draw that doesn't acknowledge human life inside the womb at conception without, as Dan's saying, condoning. It wouldn't even be murder at that point. It would simply be,
some people are not people, and you can kill them.
Yeah,
son.
you wouldn't even kill them because they're not alive.
Right,
You would you would be
by
simply
definition, you'd be excluding.
You'd be destroying matter at that point.
Yeah, which is so weird, and I've got to believe that even though that's the party line, that there's cognitive dissonance in the.
It's just like with the murder, exactly.
Yes,
and so we're stating it like this to help illustrate the fact that on both sides it doesn't work. You have to have doublethink.
Yes, in both cases.
Fit in your head.
In both cases, and one of the best examples of this I've seen is that if a woman who, you say you've got a woman, she believes in abortion, but she is, and so she accepts that if she decides that baby is not a baby, but she in this case wants the baby. She has a name for the baby. She knows its gender. It's almost, it's however far along this process, pushes your buttons, and somebody comes and deliberately tries to assault her in a way that kills the baby inside her. If you accept that it's actually not a life until it's born, you have to say all that happened was assault.
Yeah, that matter inside of her was destroyed without her permission.
Which happens when you get struck, right? Your skin cells die, and some extra cells died. Yeah.
But that what didn't happen is that someone didn't come and murder her unborn child.
Right.
They couldn't prosecute that man for murdering her unborn child.
Right.
Because that child was not a child. It was just potential.
Just something else.
It was a potential child. Yeah. And so you could add to the assault charge and argue that something else was taken from her in terms of potential that belonged to her, but you couldn't argue that a life was taken because it's not yet a human life. Because if it is, then you're acknowledging that it's a human life, and that brings us back to that gray area,
right? Which
is obviously where it is.
Right, because that woman, whether she believes in abortion or not, who was looking forward to the life of this child and was beginning to, and had a bond with that child, is not going to feel like she lost a clump of cells. She's going to feel like someone murdered a child.
And if you told her that she just lost a clump of cells and that it wasn't alive, and therefore...
Yeah, whether she believed in abortion or not, she would...
That would obviously be inaccurate.
That would be cruel.
I don't think anyone would claim that it wasn't a big deal.
They wouldn't, which highlights the inconsistency. Like you said, the double think. Something is happening here for them to assert that it's not a human life at all, and you shouldn't think of it as one. Yet we do all the time. Even they do in the right circumstances. And it's just, which takes us back to, what do you do? So let's assume that everybody agreed that it is a human life. What do you do? Truly, what do you do? I think that law should be more than just punishment of people. We talked about it in our restorative justice episode. That at least it could be. In people who are willing, law could be more about reconciliation. And law in all cases should be more about restoration. How and to whom do you restore things here? What do you do? I cannot see a world in which prison time, and I'm specifically focused on the mother here. I've set aside the doctor because it's the mother that I'm most interested in. What do you do with the mother? I don't know what you could do other than talk to her.
And I want to before you go too far into that, Dan, I want to clarify.
Interject.
There's a reason Dan's disregarding the doctor here, because to argue that it's just the doctor's fault and that he should be, I just said he as the doctor, but that the doctor should be the one solely culpable is disingenuous.
It is.
You know what I mean? It is the mother's decision to either abort or not abort, and the doctor is aiding in that. And so,
well, it's another case where if the woman wanted to keep the child and the doctor aborted it, the woman would sue the crap out of the doctor, and he would get criminal charges.
An easy case.
Yeah, yes. It would be murder, right? That would be a case.
Which is why it's clear that it's not just the doctors who are doing this.
Yes.
It's the doctor is simply assisting. And so if the mother is culpable, then the doctor can be culpable too. But you can't have a scenario where just the doctor is culpable and not the mother.
Yes.
And that's what Dan's getting at.
Yes, thank you for stopping me, because conservatives have long debated, how do we stop abortions in a way that we can say, on the one hand, that it's murder, but on the other hand, doesn't prosecute the woman in a way that makes this politically unfeasible.
Mm-hmm.
How do you...
Because if they were trying to establish jail time for the mother, it wouldn't fly. It wouldn't work.
It wouldn't fly even among conservatives,
Yeah, because we'd obviously recognize it as the wrong action.
It's the wrong action, yeah. So conservatives have debated for a long time what would be not just moral, but politically acceptable. What progress could be made on this front? And they concluded that they shouldn't prosecute the woman at all, only the doctor. And that's the standard stance of conservative legal theorists, is that you prosecute the doctor. But as you just gave the refutation for that perfectly. That makes zero sense if the woman is not culpable in some way. Unless there is a vast difference in knowledge between the woman where she has no idea, which is possible but unlikely.
But that's not what's happening in the majority of the cases.
Then,
and if that were the problem,
that would be an exception rather than the rule.
Then you would have different laws where it was,
Yes.
But that's not what we're discussing here.
That's not what we're discussing. The problem is that the woman knows that there's a baby, and whether they use that term or not, and so does the doctor. And how do you... And so I separate them because I think what the doctor is doing is fundamentally different. They're culpable for the same reason. There is the loss of a human life.
Yeah, exactly. You establish the mother's culpability first, and from there you can look at the doctor. The doctor, it would be like if you were looking at a murder case, you first need to figure out if this person committed murder before you find out if the person who drove them there is culpable in any way. Because if it wasn't murder, then the person who drove them there, it's not going to be murder. It could be something else. It could be many other things.
Right.
But at that point, it changes.
Right. Was it premeditated? Did the driver know? Yeah. Mm-hmm. That mattered.
You have to establish that first action, the first actor, before you move on.
Yeah. What is the action? What's happened is there's the loss of a human life. How to describe that? I'm not sure. It's not murder. Except there are a few circumstances I can imagine that would be exceptions where I would say it is murder. But those would be exceptions. And we mentioned a few of them. If you actually attacked someone trying to end the life of the baby. But I don't have an answer, because usually when we're looking at a crime, we go, what needs to be corrected? And on that, things like theft are really straightforward. And things like murder are very difficult. Murder, in a lot of cases, we're not looking at what needs to be corrected. Ideally, there's some reconciliation. And that's a much higher law than what we have implemented in the United States.
Yeah, but more than anything with murder, it's simply trying to stop it from happening again.
Exactly.
That's the purpose of prison.
Someone has identified themselves as a threat in a manner that makes them untrustworthy in the future. And you keep that from happening again. You're mitigating a threat. You are stopping a threat. You're not necessarily trying to restore, because how on earth do you restore a lost life? What would it mean to mitigate the threat of the mother? That seems inapplicable, right? Other than to say, again, maybe a question of knowledge in some cases, how clear they understand things. But where then is the justification for legal force? And this is where the difficulty of this becomes really clear in my mind. If I knew someone who was going to get an abortion, I would feel justified in interposing myself with force to stop them. But if they have had an abortion, I am not sure I can even come up with what punishment I think is... punishment isn't even the right word. It doesn't make sense in this context.
Yeah, what would you do, Dan, moving forward, knowing that someone's had an abortion? You wouldn't do anything. Not
with force. I can come up with no forcible solution that I think would improve the situation. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And unless, again, I can maybe think of exceptions. but a generally applicable rule, I don't know.
Yeah, and so basically, let me translate for you, Dan,
Please.
as someone who's gone back and forth with you, quite a bit over the last little bit discussing.
We know
this.
each other's ideas as well as our own at this point, I think, on this.
Is that basically what you're saying is that abortion is a unique situation where you believe that, first of all, you believe that human life begins at conception, and that therefore, even though terminating a pregnancy is not an act of murder and is definitely something different, it is an act that is morally wrong on such a level, and not just on a moral level, but on a legal level, that you would feel
with justice,
that you would be justified in using force to stop that abortion from taking place. But that the situation is so complicated and messy and gray in how it actually happens that you can't see a reasonable scenario where you would actually be doing that.
Yeah, as you're talking, I thought of one. So clearly, the father would have standing to sue to get some kind of redressment. Yes, he ought to be involved, and if he's not involved, there's something wrong, right? And that
and I agree with that. I think that paternity needs to be re-examined on a fundamental level. I think that let's start at the beginning. The mother has to go in for checkups. However that's being paid for, the husband should be 50% responsible for it. You know what I mean? Because they it's something they did together. And then they go in and she has the baby, and once again the father should be financially responsible.
Yeah.
Should share the financial responsibility, and maybe it shouldn't be 50%. I don't know. And it probably has factors. There's probably factors that could go into that, but there should be some responsibility for sure. And of course, there already is child support, assuming they're not together. And so we already do have some precedent after the fact, but earlier on, there should be more responsibility from the father. But then on top of that, there also comes more say. More say, yes, because just as the woman has say in what happens in her body, the father has say in what happens to his offspring, because that child is partially his.
In whatever sense the parents, in whatever sense a child is a parent's, the child is that father's, yeah.
Because if paternity and maternity don't matter, then the only legal rights that a mother would have are the same rights that a surrogate has. Because there's legal precedent for surrogacy, and this is getting nuanced, but I think it's important that because I think a lot of people would disagree with what we were saying about the father having any say in whether or not the mother gets an abortion. And in fact, they've been very clear on arguing that he doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And here's why he does, because a surrogate does not have the right to abort their child without consequences. There are consequences if they do. There's contracts that are set up, and there are legal ramifications, because it's understood that even though that child is in her body, and I'm not saying she can't have an abortion unilaterally, there are rules set in place, and I don't understand enough of them to speak clearly on it, but I do understand enough to understand that she does not have full say on what happens to that child, because they understand that it's not her child, it's just physically in her, which does give her some say, but not all the say.
Yes.
And just like that, the mother, because she has that child in her body, does have, I believe, more say than the father. But it does not mean that she has all the say, because I would say she has the say of the mother, and she has the say of the surrogate, and the father has the say of the father. Does that make sense,
yes,
Dan?
Yes. That you may not be able to say what proportion perhaps each of these pieces carry.
I don't think it's a percentage.
But
it's not
but
30,
whatever
30,
it is,
30 or whatever.
Whatever it is, it favors the mother slightly. Yes, I think that's accurate.
Yeah, it favors it to some degree, and that degree is worth debating, but it doesn't change the fact that the father has say as well, and that needs to be considered.
Yes, say in a way which I think renders an abortion, which even under standard laws, if you could change this and change nothing else, I would change it so that if the father wants to keep the baby, there can't be an abortion. But obviously that's a side note when we're considering abortion itself as a category, not just merely the fringes of how it operates when it is legal and what you could do to improve it.
Yeah, and the reason for that is, as you're saying, because there is a very clear justification for a father to use force to stop the mother from aborting his child.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And
just like there would be justification for the parents of that child to stop the surrogate from aborting the child that is theirs.
Yeah, so I think so you've got the loss of life, you've got the mother's decision, you've got the fact that in many cases the mother will be the only person who is still alive who is harmed. And that's that puts you in an odd spot. I'm thinking of how murder works, I guess, because not because I think it's akin to murder, as we've said over and over again, but because there are cases where it's similar, where the death of somebody leads to only one person having standing per se, but you'd say that the society has an interest is how it normally goes. I don't believe in society has an interest. I believe in moral, I believe in things that are just and unjust. And if it's unjust, it can be, you have the moral authority to stop it. So I think you absolutely have the moral authority to stop it. I really don't know. And I keep reaching for answers in our conversations that we've had. And I've reached for answers here in this one. I'm hoping to come up with something. I really don't know what to do after. I think you can stop the doctor. And I am comfortable with that, even though I don't feel like we've established necessarily what I think establishing the culpability of the mother has to be a case-by-case basis based on what they know and their circumstances. And I think the maximum is, well, I don't want to put any barriers on that, other than to say that I think this is a new area of law, and there isn't
really
something
hasn't been developed.
Yes, and I think you could draw
or
on,
it has been developed, but not nearly enough, because there has been some abortion law developed, but it's so much less than you would think there would be.
Yes, in part because of the black and white narratives of both. You know, it's not a life, it is a life, and it's murder. And it's, but if there's something else involved here, then you have to develop it from the ground up. And I don't know what that would look like. I do think you could stop the doctor from practicing if that's what they're going to do with their practice. I think you could say, you have the skills to do this. It was illegal. You shouldn't do it. At the very least, your practice is gone. You're not going to be able to do that again in the same way you would mitigate the threat of something else, the same way you prevent robbers from robbing other people or murderers from murdering other people. It's not necessarily a restoration. It's some kind of mitigation, some kind of penalty imposed on the doctor's practice. And which is ironic because I don't like that the conservatives sidestep the issue and put the weight on the doctor when obviously the woman is there. But you also
understand why they do.
But hopefully as you're listening to us, you can see why that is, because I've come to a new appreciation of it. Because that part is more clear to me. And what the doctor's moral obligations are here in not ending a human life, even though the parties involved are willing and such. And obviously the child isn't willing, can't have a say at this point, which is why this is not a good thing at all, right? But that part makes sense. But it can't leave the woman out of it. It can't leave the person who sought it out of it. That can't be the just path forward.
Your just solution.
No, it has to include her because there is culpability there. I just don't know what it would look like and what would do any good, right? There's and all of the ways you think of law. I don't know, right? Well, how would you restore things? Well, you can't. That I do know, but there's no solution. How do you mitigate this in the future? I don't know. Education is probably the best answer, but education isn't necessarily
yeah.
You send them to classes. I hate that as a solution for an adult.
Yeah, it's not.
That's not it. I don't know, but I don't know what is. I don't know what is it.
No, and I think think you hit on something when you're saying this is a new field, because I don't think necessarily that the doctors, being regulated out of existence in terms of abortions as a solution. First of all, me and Dan don't 100% agree on the moral and legal ramifications, and part of the problem is because as Dan's expressing his confusion over, how do you enforce this just act, which is to stop abortions, right?
Right. We haven't even got into the practical details of how an executive body would do that, how a police agency would do that. It would be a nightmare to try and enforce it in most cases, which is another problem.
Exactly. And,
Anyway.
and I think I agree with Dan, but I would take it a step further, because I think even on a moral level, it becomes even more confusing. A great example of where that confusion is born in my mind is I picture a couple who decide to go with some kind of artificial, in vitro fertilization. And usually what happens is you have multiple eggs and you fertilize multiple eggs in order to increase the probability that one will be fertilized.
Mm-hmm.
And you get the most successful egg, the one that's most likely to survive, and you discard the rest. Or you save them potentially, but 9 times out of 10, all of those eggs that are fertilized are not being brought to term, right?
Yeah, let me interject one detail, because I know some people who've done this.
Interject away.
They kept all of the eggs and deliberately at least tried to attempt all of them, all of the fertilized eggs,
and so that
starting
with
the most viable, based on their belief that.
And that's someone who's
applying the principles,
who's applying the pro-life principles, because otherwise, if your goal is just to have one child and you discard the other eggs, or whatever your motivations are, at that point, what you're doing is aborting a child, and you can go and you can look at the morning after pill where you are, it's a form of abortion, but it's one that's just killing, that's just destroying on the physical level, such a small number of atoms, this egg that's just barely become fertilized. It hasn't even, attached to the uterine wall. It's just floating, which is something that I can appreciate. Something that happens on a regular basis is pregnancies that go wrong, where the egg is so small that often you're not even sure if it was a pregnancy. There are early miscarriages that take place on a regular basis, and those are not necessarily always thought of the same way that a 3 or 4 month miscarriage is thought of. And that's pretty normal for people. And that's something that I've seen and experienced, obviously third hand, through different women that I've known.
Mm-hmm. We just disconnected. Carry on.
But I'm
with what
back
you're saying,
now,
Brad.
obviously. I was talking about how there is a difference. There is a difference between, those in vitro fertilized eggs that are being disposed of, or a morning after pill, versus a later pregnancy abortion. And I'm not arguing that it's not because it's not taking away the loss of an innocent life. It's because of something else that I can't quite put my finger on, and something that I think a lot of people resonate with the fact that is different. And that, I think, is one of the many factors that needs to be considered, along with what Dan was talking about before, which is the knowledge that the woman has, the situation that she's in, a lot of other factors that need to be looked at on an individual basis before we can take any kind of culpability about what is taking place.
Yeah, one of the things you mentioned that a frequent argument against against believing that it's a life is people will say, well, you don't care about the conceived, the conceptions happened, but they haven't, but through natural processes, right? It doesn't attach or whatever, and it's lost. And they make that an equivalent of an abortion. Say, well, abortions are happening all the time. In a lot of ways, I think it's a silly argument because it misses the point. There's things that happen because of nature, and you are not responsible for those. And there are things that happen because of your actions, and you're responsible for those. And I think it's that simple. There are things which happen because of what we do rather than what we, and then there are things that happen outside of our knowledge that we can't be culpable for either. So there's a lot of things that happen. Like if you're taking birth control and you somehow conceive without knowing it, you continue to take birth control, that causes an abortion, and all of this would happen and you never know, right? You obviously are not morally culpable for that action. You didn't know. You couldn't have known. And that brings up some interesting questions perhaps about the ethics of birth control in general, which leads to, I think, the Catholic stance on it. But you can agree that it's a human life and have a different opinion on that. And what you were saying about in vitro fertilization, there's a reason it was controversial first because it gets into the weeds of these things that we've been discussing. And I think what's missing there is the natural emotional attachment that forms when you are pregnant and the process is going forward. But but I don't think the absence of that, and this is probably a point we disagree on, I don't think the absence of that actually does change anything. It doesn't, I don't think it changes the nature of it as a life, though it might have an effect on things like culpability and the way it's viewed like that. Because it does affect the perceptions, and thus it does affect the culpability in different things.
Yeah, and it affects the and not just the culpability, but the moral aspect of it too. Because so much of what makes our actions good or bad on a purely moral level is how we interpret those actions.
Yes, how we interpret them at the time, going into the decision. Our knowledge at the time and how, yes, absolutely. You're judged, if you were to be judged perfectly, you'd be judged against what you know when you make the decision, not against what you know after or when you're in your clearest head.
And then taking that back to the culpability, I think there definitely is different culpability. And so that does make it. The reason I'm bringing this up is because I want to be clear that at least from my perspective, you can fully accept that human life begins at conception and still understand that there are legal and moral gray areas when it comes to abortion, and that's okay. That is a legitimate place to be, and I think that when it comes down to it, you take the politics out of it, I think that's where most people are.
It really is.
In some kind of moral gray area, and people keep trying to suck us over to one side or the other. And so I'm trying to be the voice here. I'm trying to be someone that you can listen to who's defending what you might actually really believe when you get past those outer layers.
Yes. Which is what we need, right? Because the outer layers are doing us very little good. They're doing us no good.
Yeah,
they're doing no good, and it's ignoring the real difficulties of the issue, which is even if we were all on the same page about the nature of it, where we go from there is very difficult to decide.
And to build on that doing no good, this conservative law in Texas is a great example because conservatives would argue, it's the wartime mentality. We got to get what we can. This law is not going to accomplish that. This law is not going to stand. And it's actually creating a large amount of ammunition for the other side and is going to strengthen the pro-choice movement in many different ways. You know what I mean? And it's something that keeps happening because when pro-choice people, act in ways like this Texas law, but on the other side, it does the exact same thing for pro-life people. It strengthens their convictions and makes them less likely to budge. That the argument that is made with the wartime mentality is because it's wartime, we have to push harder, when in reality, the harder you push, the less you're going to accomplish. that the wartime mentality is a Chinese finger trap. and that you just need to let go for a second and you'll realize you've been tugging against nothing.
Right, which is not to say discard your passion or your conviction. It's to say channel them in productive ways, right? It's to say reconsider how you're going about it so that you can actually have conversations. Because at the end of the day, persuasion will do what these laws will never do. These laws are never going to get us there. I love this law in some ways. I think the legal innovations in it are extremely trippy and suggest all kinds of things. It's got serious problems and it isn't going to advance the cause in terms of pro-life, as Brad was saying. It's not. For all its, though I like it, I may even like that they tried it. This is not a victory. Even if it stayed in place, I don't think it would cause more problems than it helps.
It's absolutely not.
Yeah. So where does that leave us? Can we have any kind of wrap up from this? I mean, the constitutionality of abortion is a silly concept. The idea that politics is going to solve it is so complicated and so gray that I don't see how. In part because of the division, and in part because when you actually start to get into what it would look like, it looks like new territory. It looks like something we haven't solved yet, rather than something that despite how sure both sides are, it looks uncharted, which is bizarre.
And I think, Dan, when you say where does that leave us, I think that there's one area that you can look at, and that's that progress can be made and progress will be made when you search for the common ground. One thing that I remember from the GOP National Convention last year during Trump's presidential campaign is that when they talked about abortion, one thing they specifically focused on was late-term abortions. And the reason they did that is because most Americans do not believe in late-term abortion.
Yeah, I think it's a vast majority.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and so instead of focusing on areas where we disagree, and trying to push the boundary farther that way, like this Texas law is doing, which, as Dan said, is not going to accomplish something, they instead said, hey, the vast majority of Americans believe that there is something morally reprehensible about very late-term abortions. And yet, there are so many states that allow them. That was one of the things that we're looking at, is that something that's still legally allowed, even though most Americans think it shouldn't be. So let's work on that. And I point that out as just an example of how even that, which is still somewhat controversial, moving towards common ground and moving towards understanding where the other side is coming from is going to be much more effective than pulling away. Yes. And that's what we need to have with abortion, is not just that, but even more discussions about these gray areas and what can be done. And I think... And this is important, is this is far beyond the GOP National Convention. I think a lot of these solutions, as we've said before, are going to be non-government. Because as Dan's saying, that government action in general is difficult, but when it comes to abortion, is more often than not going to cause more harm than good. And that true positive change is going to come through non-government action. I firmly believe that.
Absolutely. In this case, I don't see a way forward that isn't almost entirely in the private sphere. And you mentioned, we mentioned how uncomfortable this conversation is, or I did, how it makes us both uncomfortable, with me in particular. When we talked about racism way back when we were just doing it was like our 7th episode, was it?
I think so, yeah.
It took a lot of talking between us and reading and things to get to a point where I felt sure enough in what I was throwing out there to be what felt at the time like a lone voice. Now, since then, I feel like lots of people ended up reading the exact same books we did. If we had been famous, we would have been trendsetters because we were ahead of the curve. But and I think at this point you can have discussions about it that you couldn't then. I have never heard a conversation like the one we just had on abortion, ever, from any source.
Which seems weird.
Which seems weird. Either we're up in the night, And that's entirely possible, right? Maybe Brad and I are saying things that aren't there. We're complicating things that are not that complicated. That's possible.
But I don't think so.
We obviously we don't think we are. We would not have made an episode. Brad, I'm glad to hear you don't think so. I thought you did, and we were wasting our time here.
My goal here is to say obvious things. I'm doing what I can.
But I have never heard someone talk about it this way with perhaps, not in an extended conversation like this. Jordan Peterson was asked once what he thought of abortion. And he said, he thought for a moment and silence, then said, I think first off that abortion is wrong. But it's not that simple. And then he began to talk about it for a few minutes. And his answer is worth listening to because I think he was at least on to some of the same things we're talking about. How most of the problems that lead you to a situation where abortion seems like a good idea are entirely preventable and things that should not have happened, right? And then that ideally society would have addressed long before it got to it. Abortions, whatever you think of abortions, you could rapidly decrease the amount of abortions through a lot of things that are entirely unrelated, right?
Mm-hmm.
Things that have gone wrong in people's lives, help that could have been given and wasn't. Decisions that could have been made better that weren't for a variety of reasons.
No, and that's part of what we're talking about when I say non-government action.
Yes, yes.
I mean, just something as simple as making sure that those who want it have access to birth control could make a huge difference, and you don't need government to do that. If your goal is to reduce the number of abortions, speaking as pro-life, that would be a very simple solution.
Yeah, sex education. Done
is huge.
Properly, obviously, that's a as I say that.
Well,
the way it's done,
and that might be part of the problem is that pro-life groups tend to not favor things like teaching prophylaxis, and I think that's a mistake. I am a pro-life advocate who believes strongly in sex education
and obviously birth control.
Well, yeah, and sex education usually includes
at least knowledge of it.
Part of that.
Yes.
I mean, the famous or infamous is the handing out of condoms, in the sex education classes,
right?
Which is a rudimentary but effective form of birth control,
right? And it's entirely possible that some forms of sex education are such that they preach abortion with so little negative connotation that people they don't rely on it for birth control, but they take risks they wouldn't if they thought abortion was worse, right?
And here's the problem, Dan, is if you don't believe in sex education at all, you cut yourself out of the discussion of what a sex education class should look like.
Of what sex education should look like.
If you say sex education is just abstinence and anything else is a problem, you cut yourself out of the negotiation process. Instead of saying, I believe in sex education, but here's what I do believe in regards to these issues, and let's come to the table and talk about it and see if we can reach an agreement.
Yes,
approaching it that way is going to get you into the door when abstinence only is going to get you shut out. You're either going to win and get abstinence only, or you're going to lose and get nothing. Right. And that all or nothing approach is a bad idea.
I'm a firm believer you need both groups. You need the group that says, no, this is wrong, and I will not do that, period. And they refuse to compromise, and they may be cut out of a discussion. And this is generally applicable. I'm not saying this is what I think on this particular issue. But in politics, you need someone who will do that, who will hold their ground no matter what. And then you need someone who doesn't, who says, we've lost this battle, and we can make it can be better or worse depending on what we do from here. And I want to make it better. and they make whatever compromises they need to. I think you can compromise in a way that doesn't compromise your principles, right? You can compromise in a way that isn't deceptive, that isn't a lie, that doesn't resort to just playing a game, and that doesn't compromise or force you to be contrary to your principles, and take either one of those roads. And which one is right is going to vary. But yes, sex education is a good example of where people threw in their chips that they had in this game, saying they weren't going to play, and the result is their voices are simply not there. And that may have been that was likely a massive mistake. Yeah. So, we've said a lot. Let's pause it there.
Yeah. Thank you guys for listening, and we apologize for any offense that that may have been given. Our goal, as we said, was to have a genuine, sincere conversation, and it was not politically correct, but I hope it was at least interesting and maybe a little bit helpful. Thank you for listening.
Till next week.